Hi, welcome friends. This is a very short course on ethics. It deals with some of the important problems with which ethics is concerned as an academic discipline. It also deals with the nature of ethics, what is the subject matter of ethics, what are the different theoretical frameworks with which ethics deals with. So we'll start with some of the very fundamental questions about ethics, or rather, to put it in a different way, try to understand some of the basic issues that we try to address in ethics. And in this lecture, what I'm going to do is that we'll basically start with the idea of morality or morals and tries to understand its relationship with ethics, because ethics is largely a discipline, an academic discipline, or rather a more rational endeavor to understand the basic fundamental concepts that morality employs. So it's a rational endeavor in one sense. So we'll try to address ethics in that way, or try to understand ethics in that way. And now we'll also deal with in this lecture some of the basic questions about morality and tries to find some answers to them, and also the subject matter of ethics. So these are roughly the topics which we are planning to cover in this lecture. Now let's start with ethics or moral philosophy. I'm using in this course moral philosophy and ethics as synonyms. There are different approaches to this. Some ethicists believe that they are different, but for my concern in this course, I'm using them as synonyms, because for me, ethics deals with the ways of thinking philosophically about morality. Because morals and morality are not necessarily philosophical. They are not necessarily the result of philosophical reflections. Philosophical reflections, as we all know, involves a lot of rationalization. It demands a sense of rationalization because we need to justify our assumptions and beliefs to other people, and there should be some level of, if you don't want to call it objectivity, some level of intersubjectivity is required when we talk about philosophy or philosophical reflection. But all moral assumptions of all human societies and cultures are not necessarily philosophically substantive or philosophically profound. They have evolved over a period of time in due course as a result of several realities, several situations a particular society encounters in its social evolution, in its cultural evolution. So most of the human societies have certain cultural beliefs, certain moral beliefs, assumptions, certain conventions, certain customs, and several factors have influenced in the formation of these customs and conventions. We'll very briefly discuss these issues in this lecture. And ethics as a discipline, as a reflective endeavor, I would call it a reflective endeavor because ethics involves reflection on morality. That's why it is called moral philosophy. It's a practice of philosophical reflection, and it analyzes the moral judgments we make. We make a lot of different kinds of moral judgments in our life. When we say that it's bad or it's good, it's right to do that, or it's wrong to do this. When we make such moral judgments, it is behind such moral judgments, behind making such moral judgments, there are several assumptions about morality, which are rooted in our culture, which are rooted in our education, and which might undergo changes. Definitely, it's not that none of our assumptions and beliefs are permanent. They might undergo changes. We can be educated in ethics, and we keep on educating ourselves through socialization process. When we go to another country, when we familiarize ourselves with another societies, their conventions and their customs and moral assumptions, we do often change or question our own assumptions, and we develop a different kind of, or rather our moral assumptions also undergo some substantial changes. So all these are possible, but ethics as a reflective endeavor involves it rather raises certain questions about morality. We know that the term ethics is derived from the Greek word ethos, and morality is derived from the Latin word mores. They are terms having to do with custom, habit, and behavior. So in a very important way, we can see that historically itself, these words, or rather these disciplines and these endeavors, are associated with customs, habits, and behavior of human beings. If you start with behavior, of course, the traditional discipline, the traditional definition of ethics is normative science of conduct of human beings living in society. So when we talk about normative science, it deals with certain standards. A standard of what? Standard of behavior. There is a norm or there is a standard according to which you are expected to behave. So many societies have such standards of behavior, and any deviance from such standards are treated to be objectionable, sometimes punishable, and in any case they involve certain very serious consequences. So it deals with behavior, it deals with habit, because habit formation is very important in among human beings and also societies. There are certain habits which individuals have which are good, which we term as good, which we term as bad, right, wrong, etc. And again, customs. Many of our assumptions, as I already mentioned, are based on customs, or rather, to put it in other words, they are customary. And as I already mentioned, ethics is a philosophical study of morality. It involves reflection. It has to think about, conceptually analyze why certain things are right, what makes a particular action a right action or a good action, or what are the criteria when we apply in order to evaluate, in order to morally evaluate a particular behavior or a particular action. So that is why it involves reflection. And every society has morals, but ethics is a reflective endeavor, and the kind of ethics which different societies have developed would be definitely different. It demands philosophical reflection, high-level philosophical reflection sometimes. Now again, morality or ethics, both, they deal with a set of principles that guide our behavior, that aim at harmonious social living. It's very important that individuals establish a harmony among themselves and also individual and society. So this is important for human progress, this is important for human living, happiness and well-being of human beings and humankind in general. So in that sense, we can say that ethics and morality deal with certain principles that guide human behavior, and these principles, as I already mentioned, have evolved over a period of time. There are several factors which might have influenced their evolution. We'll discuss some of these factors in later lectures. And they try to bring order to both individual and collective human being. And I have already mentioned they aim at addressing conflicts, to resolve conflicts or to minimize the kind of conflicts that might evolve, that might emerge in human social living or social life. And this is a kind of view by Alexander Skutch. He says that ethics is an effort of harmonization to mitigate the conflicts in our relationships, and it's the study of the impulse that leads to this endeavor, the methods it employs, and the phenomena to which it gives rise. So an effort to harmonization is conscious or unconscious effort to harmonization is there, because without such process of harmonizations, no human societies can survive, and also to mitigate conflicts. That's very important. For this, some sort of regulations are required, some norms or behavior are required, and ethics deals with the principles that suggest such norms. Let's try to understand some questions about morality now. How do we decide what is moral? What makes a particular action moral? So some of these things we do quite unreflectively in our day-to-day life. Every day, all of us make a lot of moral judgments and pass such judgments in public and also in private. When we think about it, when we read the newspaper, when we hear some news about something happening in society, we all form and make moral judgments. But behind these moral judgments, most of the time these moral judgments are passed without much of a reflection. And if you really start reflecting upon them, we would realize that some of these assumptions are really questionable, quote unquote questionable, because they involve very unreflective assumptions which might not be right if we consider them again with a reflective, with a more analytical eye. So we have to involve ourselves in a more serious conceptual, ethical and philosophical inquiry to understand their nature and how to distinguish the moral from the immoral, because again, if you go through the newspapers, for example, let's take the example, a day-to-day example, there are several such disturbing news events that come to our mind. They remind us about human actions which are objectionable, which we can term as moral or immoral. How do we distinguish them? If you try to reflect upon them, we'll understand certain very disturbing facts about our moral assumptions. Are moral principles always binding on us? Do we have to always respect the freedom of individuals? Because normally it is stated that it's very important that we should respect freedom. Freedom is being treated in nowadays particularly as a very important virtue, as a very important principle to be observed, that we should consider every individual as free and we should respect their freedom. But at the same time, on certain occasions, freedom of individuals have to be limited, controlled and restricted. There are several occasions. Say for example, if you know that a particular individual is going to kill another individual, it's sort of a moral duty on our side to prevent this individual from performing such a crime. So we must do anything, say on certain occasions, try to stop him, prevent him by locking him inside a room or restricting his freedom of movement to stop him from performing such a heinous act. So there we are restricting his freedom. There we are not respecting his freedom but restricting it. But on another occasion where a particular individual has some criticism against an authority, say a government, he should or she should be free to express it by keeping in mind all responsibility, by making his or her statements with responsibility, that with a clear awareness that there are certain reasons why he or she does it. He or she can convince others about his or her reasons by explaining them. So there we respect his or her freedom. On another occasion, we have to sometimes restrict the freedom of an individual. So the freedom or respect for freedom is not unconditional. So on what conditions they can be treated as principle? Do we need to be honest always? Normally it is stated that honesty is the best policy and we all have to be honest. That's true. But in general, though honesty is the best policy, is honesty the best policy always in all circumstances? Not necessarily. There are certain occasions where honesty can harm people. Say suppose a dacoit or someone who wants to kill somebody else who is hiding in my office or in my home, and this person comes in search of that person and asks me, do you know where this person has gone? If I tell him the truth, then probably the person who is hiding in my home might lose his life. So to prevent that from happening, I can be dishonest. I can always tell him that I don't know. Whether he believe or not is a different question. What I'm saying is that in principle, honesty need not be construed as the best policy always, because all these concepts often appear to be having relevance, or rather all these principles like honesty is the best policy, respecting freedom, all these are principles which are valuable, but at the same time they seem to be having some sort of, their application varies from context to context, place to place, time to time, etc. For example, at the time of war, freedom of individuals is a questionable principle. Freedom cannot be sometimes, when a war is declared with another country, states often restrict the freedom of its own citizen to prevent from facing problems internally. So this might be justified. A state can justify this on the basis of a larger concern, a larger crisis needs to be addressed immediately. Now, what do I gain by being moral? This is a very interesting question, which is a very perplexing question rather, because the question is often, being moral, being honest, being a person who respects the freedom and rights of other persons sometimes seem to be costly. Sometimes, the person who does it might be wondering why he or she should be doing that. What do I gain by being moral? While many others are taking advantage of being immoral, engaging themselves in immoral activities, I am so honest, I am so moral, and I am not gaining anything, rather I am losing. So what ultimately am I gaining from this? So that's a very interesting question which has several aspects which can be answered from various points of view. Say for example, Immanuel Kant, very important ethicist whom we are going to discuss in this lecture course, a philosopher, German philosopher, would have a very interesting answer to provide to that question, while utilitarians like Bentham and J.S. Mill will have another set of answers, Aristotle's virtue ethics framework will provide you a very different answer to this question, because for a virtue ethicist, being honest is a virtue. A honesty is actually a virtue, and being a honest man is something which an Aristotelian would aspire to become. So it varies. The answer to these questions might vary from framework to framework. And again, you have various religious frameworks, like Christianity offers you a very strong and a very interesting religious framework for morality. Then if you come to India, Buddhism and Hinduism and other religious frameworks also offer very interesting reasons and justifications for being morals, and they also have their own ideals, their own ideas, their own conceptions of morality. Now let's see some pictures here and try to visualize or try to remember from this image what kind of an impression these images create in your mind. And say, for example, let's take this picture represents the Challenger mishap, which has happened several decades ago, in 1986, when the NASA had launched the Challenger spaceship. Within seconds of its launch, it has exploded, killing the astronauts who were traveling in it, which raised several ethical concerns. It's a very interesting case for ethicists to learn very important lessons from it, because the previous day of the launch, the engineers were not very strongly recommending a launch, because there were some doubts about the O-rings which is used in the shuttle. But the managers were, on the other hand, pressurizing the engineers, because they say that, we have to launch it because there is something called business integrity. If we don't do that, then that might affect our business chances in future. So we have to go for the launch. So there is apparently a conflict between engineers who are technocrats and scientists, and managers who are concerned more about the investment made for the launch. Huge investment have been made for the launch, but for the engineers, the major concern is the science behind it, the kind of science they use, whether it's a good science or doubtful. I mean, they want to rule out all possible doubts regarding the safety of the launch, but they couldn't do that. So they were not ready for a launch, and this conflict went on. Finally, the managers won over the engineers. There is a famous statement that you have to remove your engineer's cap and wear a manager's cap. So ultimately, this is what has happened. The Challenger exploded within minutes, within seconds of its launch, and killing all the astronauts and also millions of dollars and the pride, the American pride. Then this is another one, the Ford Pinto controversy. We regard this car which the famous automobile giant Ford had designed, and this car was designed with a certain objective in mind, following the principle of norm 2000, that the car should weigh less than 2,000 pounds and it should cost less than $2,000. And in its hurry to come up with such a design, because there was a lot of competition from the Japanese car makers, so they were in a hurry, they were frustrated to come up with a design which would attract the American buyers. Ultimately, what happened was they compromised on several important safety concerns, which ultimately resulted in several issues. Several safety concerns were proved to be true, and many people lost their lives and many people met with accidents. Finally, the company earned a lot of bad name with this model and had to roll back the model. So this is another case. Probably if there is time, we will also discuss this case in one of our later lectures. And this is another one. This is something which you are witnessing in the contemporary world from fundamental religious organization called ISIS. And here is a scene where they are killing some of their poor victims whom they have captured just because they don't like them. They are trying to eliminating their enemies. And this is a very important, there is a very famous photograph of Vietnam War. This is another one which represents the Holocaust, which is again treated as one of the greatest crimes against humanity. And this is another photograph from the Vietnam War, which has won several awards, this photograph. And this is another photograph of the atom bomb exploding in Hiroshima and Nagasaki, one of those places. And this is a very different photograph from India, from Bhopal, where a small little child is found dead. Its head is being seen, and it's going to be buried under the mud. So this represents one of the sad phases of the Bhopal gas tragedy. And this is a recent phenomenon, Endosulfan impact, which is called as the spray of death, which is used by plantations. Endosulfan is used by plantations as a pesticide, which had serious consequences on the health of people who are living in the nearby areas, which affected people, which caused several serious health problems. And this slide would give you the effects of endosulfan and the kind of toxic chemical used in spraying. And these images which I have just shown you, they represent some sort of actions which are objectionable. We can call them as objectionable actions. We have reasons to call them objectionable, and some of them are also justified by a few. Say for example, the Holocaust was justified by the Nazis when it was done, and the Vietnam War, the cruelties of the Vietnam War, the US when it was involved in a war with the Vietnam, means they have done all these cruelties and they justified it. So to some extent some people have justified it, but in general most people reasonably believe that they are wrong. These actions are wrong. And what makes them wrong is an interesting question for us from the point of view of ethics. And they represent different aspects of human life. Say for example, one is the Challenger incident, which is again a conflict between the engineers and the managers. Then again, high level technology is involved. Bhopal gas tragedy involves industrial disasters. Vietnam War, and that is kind of, war crimes are involved. Then in the case of Holocaust, racism is involved. Several aspects of human life is involved in it, but there is something common in all of them, that they all qualify to be termed as objectionable actions. Regardless of their different context, such actions are considered seriously wrong, objectionable by humanity in general. And let's come to some other images here. This is a very beautiful image of the salt satyagraha, which has been photographed beautifully, which represented the very concept of satyagraha for several decades in the Indian subcontinent, but also in the world, all over the world, that Gandhiji and breaking the law. He breaks a law in order to and makes salt and breaks the repressive British law. So he represents freedom, the principle of freedom, the value of freedom, the virtue of freedom. And again, Mother Teresa's divine charity. This picture is another impression. It creates another impression in our mind. The divine charity of this lady who loved unconditionally and who is treated as the mother, the divine mother for thousands of people in all over the world. And here you will see Mandela. Mandela struggles for freedom, who spent most of his life, 20 years of his life in the jail, and finally became victorious and president of South Africa. And he represents the ceaseless craving for human freedom, courage. And these are all these actions represented in these people, Gandhiji, Mother Teresa and Mandela. We can say that they are all praiseworthy actions, something which is praiseworthy because they are considered to be virtuous actions by virtuous people. Gandhiji, Mandela, they are all virtuous people, and again they represent courage, compassion, love, freedom, liberty, etc., which are principles which we value, which we consider are virtues, principles which add a lot of value and meaning and purpose to human life. And many of us believe that such principles have to be emulated in our life so that we can also live and lead a meaningful life, a more fruitful life. And again, such people and character deserve to be respected. They deserve human respect. And now the question is the basis. What makes such actions reasonably praiseworthy and some other actions reasonably objectionable and even condemnable? What is the criteria? On what basis can we say that these are good and those certain other actions are bad? And usually we do that very unreflectively. As I already mentioned, I don't think most of us agree that the two sets of actions which I have represented through images are very different. And while Gandhiji's salt satyagraha and Mother Teresa's divine love and Mandela's struggle for freedom, these are all actions which represent human values, human virtue. The other kind of actions which I have picturized represent something wrong about doing them. So most of us agree in that, but even though we agree quite unreflectively. We have to justify them. On what basis we can say that this is right and that is wrong? And again, what do we do when we recognize actions as right or wrong? When we say that a particular action is right, when we say that a particular another set of actions are wrong. For example, copying in an exam is wrong. On what basis? What do we do when we do that, when we recognize it? Are there any objective basis or criteria to decide that a set of actions are right and a set of actions are wrong? Unfortunately, often this is not the case. We often do not have an objective basis or criteria. People might disagree on these. Many such actions are doubtful, though there are many actions which are largely reasonably agreed upon by majority of human beings. There is no way you can say that they are absolutely right, or there is an absolute criteria to distinguish good actions from wrong actions. When we talk about the criteria, how do we really try to arrive at the judgment when we say that a particular action is right? Whether the action itself, or the intentions behind the actions, or the consequences of the actions, or the character of the people. Say for example, in this case, the character of Hitler. The character of Hitler is, and the character of the manager who pressurized for a launch of Challenger, or overpowering, or rather bypassing the very strong opposition of the engineers. That's a quite objectionable action. The character of Hitler can be questioned. The character of that general who shoots that young innocent chap is questionable, is wrong. And while on the other hand, the character of people like Gandhiji and Mandela and Mother Teresa are praiseworthy. So are we really looking at the character of these people, or are we really looking at the consequences of their action, what they gained by performing a certain kind of action, or what was their original intentions? And these are some of the things which we need to understand, and based on the answer given, we have different theoretical frameworks. See, a Kantian would probably focus on the intentions, utilitarian would possibly highlight the consequences, and a virtue ethicist like Aristotle would highlight the character of the person to be emulated in your life as important when it comes to ethics. And with this, we will try to understand what is ethics. Is there anything beyond mere feelings that an action is right or wrong? So when we talk about ethics, is there anything beyond mere feelings? Just I feel that it's right, or I feel that it's wrong. I mean, if you ask a common man, he or she may not be able to tell us anything more than that. He would just say that, okay, I feel so, I think so. But why do you think so? And many think that ethics is not just following one's feelings. It's not just following one's feelings. Sometimes, following your feelings can be gravely mistaken. You might be gravely mistaken, and it might be very seriously wrong also. So these things have to be kept in mind. Again, are our assumptions about right and wrong derived from religious beliefs? Of course, yes. To some extent, it is true that our religions have played a very important role in the evolution of moral assumptions and customs and conventions in human societies. But what about non-religious people and atheists, who are quite common today? There are many people who do not believe in any religion, many people who do not believe in God, but they also value ethics. They also think that being ethical is important, and they also have certain assumptions about ethics, which largely they agree with people who are believers and people who believe in God or religion and all that. So what is that? What about them then? Again, is there anything in ethics more than what the law prescribes? Because there is a tendency, particularly in today's world, particularly in the professional context, if you go and talk to a professional, an engineer or a manager or a businessman, and tell him that you have to be ethical, he would say that, okay, yes, I am ethical, I am following all the laws. Whatever the laws the country has prescribed, I am following. But beyond that, I am not. Why should I? For me, I mean for him, for such a hardcore professional, sometimes we find that ethics is synonymous with law. He doesn't think that there is anything beyond law in ethics, anything beyond in ethics that is to be valued by him or her. So are they synonymous? And we can say that there are diverse laws, and they often contradict each other and change over time. So laws, of course ethics also change over time, but ethics and law may overlap, but they are not always overlapping, and they are not synonyms. There are certain actions which are ethical but illegal. For example, Gandhiji's breaking of the salt law. The salt satyagraha was illegal because it involved an explicit breaking of a law which existed in the country, but he thought that it is ethical, it is moral to do that. Rather, for Gandhiji, he considered that it is his moral responsibility to break the law, which is inhuman. And there are vice versa. There are certain principles that are ethical which are illegal. So they don't overlap always. So we have to really distinguish them. We have to understand that one, ethics and law are different. Do ethics exhaust social norms? There are issues where clear norms are absent. So we cannot say that ethics is exhausted with social norms. So these are some of the basic questions which raised in this lecture. So we'll continue with this topic in the next lecture also. For the time being, let us wind up this lecture. Goodbye.